Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Spring Lecture Series for 2021. My name is Carrie Soden. I am the Archaeological Director here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Thank you all for signing up. I know I say this every time, but we've had a huge outpouring of support. When we first decided to do Zoom presentations, we thought you can get it at 100 people or you can get it at 500 people. And we thought, we're going to get more than 100, but we don't need anywhere near 500. We sold out as much as you could sell out a free ticket for tonight's event. So thank you so much. We also raised over $1,000 in donations. Please don't forget, you can always still donate to us at nmgl.org/donate. Tonight is our first extension of our spring lecture series. Normally we only do 3 each spring, but it's been going so well, and we want to make sure that we continue our programming for all of you while we continue to work on getting out of this pandemic. As always, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, so please submit your questions through the Q&A icon on your screen. And with that, tonight, this evening we have a presentation entitled An Illustrated History of the Soo Locks. Our presenter tonight is Michelle Briggs, who reminded me when I contacted her after sitting on a panel together earlier this spring that we'd actually met several years ago when she came down to visit the new museum in Toledo. And so I was very humbly apologizing that I had kind of forgotten that we had met before. Michelle has been the Chief Park Ranger at the Soo Locks since 2009, or as I heard her say on this panel that we sat on, the Lone Ranger. Before joining the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, she spent 15 years working in museums throughout the Great Lakes region and earned a Bachelor's and Master's degree in history from Western Michigan University, focusing on Great Lakes Maritime history and museum studies topics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and I'm going to go away, and I will come back at the end and talk to you guys all about your questions and answers.
Okay, super. Thank you for the nice introduction. And I will also confess that with my background in Great Lakes Maritime history, landing this job here at the Soo Locks was certainly a dream come true. And I am also a longtime boat nerd. My first interest in boats that I can remember was as a little kid on the Straits of Mackinac, taking the ferry to Mackinac Island and watching the Chief Wawadam crossing the straits. And it just kind of has grown from there. And luckily, I was able to turn it into a career. In my presentation tonight, I have a lot of photos. There's a few that I Googled and found fair use images, but the majority of them are from a 1,700 image glass plate negative collection that we have at the Soo Locks. This collection is available at the Clark Historical Library online. You can just Google Clark Historical Library Soo Locks images and that'll get you there. And it's also available on the National Archives. The Soo Locks, you may not realize, are a National Historic Landmark. We're one of less than 3,000 in the entire country, and we take the responsibility to protect the historic fabric of our site very seriously. And it can be very much a challenge because we also, while protecting the historic structures, have to also evolve and change with the needs of shipping and technology. And everything that we do that affects the appearance of the site, everything from light poles, trash cans to the windows, has to be reviewed and approved by the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office. So just to backtrack a little, where in the world is the Soo Locks? The Soo Locks are right here. And I will, like most people from Michigan, I will brag that you can see our state from space. I also like this image that because you can see how the Great Lakes all connect. There's the St. Mary's River running right through here, the Straits of Mackinac here. Out of the frame, of course, is the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, and then, of course, Lake Erie, where the Toledo is situated. The Great Lakes were the first international superhighway, long before there were railroads and highways. Even before there was a Holy Roman Empire, there was a great transportation network throughout the upper Midwest. And the Hopewell Indian Mounds that you have there in Ohio, they have found native copper, which came from the Western UP, which most certainly would have traveled down through our Great Lakes, through the water, and of course through St. Marie to get there. I will point out here that the mistake on this slide is not mine. The mistake is on this 1855 drawing. Right here, they have an apostrophe in St. Mary's. St. Mary's River does not actually have an apostrophe. It is just spelt like this. And the St. Mary's River is also not actually a river, it's a strait. It's a series of connected waterways that connect Lake Superior to Lake Huron. And as you may be aware, Lake Superior, oops, I hit a wrong button. That happens every single time. Got ahead of myself, apologize. Lake Superior is at roughly 602 feet above sea level. Lake Huron is 580 feet below sea level. So the St. Mary's River carries the water through, and through its course, it drops 22 feet. It drops 20 of those feet in the 3/4 mile stretch right at Sault Ste. Marie. This is a picture that I was able to take from the roof of the hydropower plant during a particularly heavy high water period. And you can see what's left of those rapids. And this is not navigable. This area has been, in addition to being a transportation hub, was also an important part of community life for the Ojibwe people. They would gather here every summer in the thousands and encamp on the shores and harvest whitefish. This is a painting of actually Sault Ste. Marie from 1840s by Paul Kane. And here's a picture of the harvesting the whitefish. This is probably a colorized photo. This is much later, obviously. This, because we have the railroad bridge across the back you see there. That bridge was built in 1887. And we have the fisheries, which I forget when it was built, but it was there until about 1907 or so. And one thing I like to just pause for a minute and talk about is we're often taught history with certain themes, and they all are kind of tied to a chronological point, and then they stop there. For instance, when I was a kid, we learned about Native Americans during the late fall, during Thanksgiving time, and then we never talked about them again. And that's not the way history works. It's not the way our lives work. And Native American history is just like ours. It's something that is continually evolving, and it is constantly occurring. And even though there's no more encampments, the Native American peoples, the Ojibwe people, are still an important part of our community and our economy. And I have no doubt that they are included in the pictures of the workforce and the work that they're doing throughout this presentation, just like they're part of our workforce at the Soo Locks today. So back to the river, when the French explorers arrived, they recorded and documented that they could hear it from 4 miles away. And of course, with the typical urge, they ignored the fact that the place already had a name. It was called Bawading, and they renamed it something which I presume they probably thought was simpler, Sault Ste. Marie, which you see here spelled out, and its literal translation is approximately Falls of St. Mary. And it's a really fun town now. We just say Sault Ste. Marie, and that's really fun if you've got to call an automated operator and they ask for the name of your town. As I mentioned, it is not navigable. Right here, you can see during a period of low water in 2010, the bedrock underneath, this is Jacobsville sandstone, and it was not possible even to navigate a canoe through that rapids. They would have to unload at the upper end, portage everything around, carry it, and then reload it at the base of the falls. Which is why in the height of the fur trade in 1797, the Northwest Company decided it was worth the investment to build a canoe lock. This little lock was built on the north shore of the river on the Canadian side, and it was about 40 feet long. And you see they have some ox there to haul the canoe through. A Voyageur Montreal canoe could carry about 3,000 tons. There's a great exhibit at the museum there in Toledo. It was one of the things on my visit I was most impressed with, is that pack. It's a loaded Voyageur pack, and you stand underneath it. And when you stand up, you feel the weight of the parcels they would have had to carry around every time they portaged a canoe. And it certainly makes you appreciate why you would want a lock instead of having to carry everything around. Unfortunately, that lock didn't last long. We had this little disagreement with Great Britain in 1812. And in 1814, a little band, maybe a bit like this one, of Americans went to Sault Ste. Marie and they destroyed that lock. So we had no lock. and we had to go back to carrying everything around the rapids. This is a picture, or a drawing, of Portage Avenue in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And portage, as you may realize, is another old French word, and it means to carry, portage. And that means they had to portage everything, even the boats. This is the Independence. It was the first steamship on Lake Superior. It was built in Chicago in 1845. They navigated up the river from Chicago, Lake Michigan, the Straits, all the way up to the river. And then at the foot of the rapids, they had to haul it out of the water. They put it on this special cradle, and then they used these gigantic logs to roll it up Portage Avenue for that 3/4 of a mile. And it took them 7 weeks. And that boat also didn't last long. And in 1854, just before there could be a lock in the Soo to speed its progress, it blew up just west of the rapids. A newspaper account from the time described it as reduced to atoms. And there's a wild story of a survivor who claims he was hurled 140 feet up in the air, caught a bale of hay, and managed to ride it down and survive. No way of proving if that's true or not. In the 1960s, though, the propeller, which you see here, was salvaged from the river and is now displayed in the park at the Soo Locks. So if you come and visit us, you can go and see that propeller and you can get your selfie taken with it. So we're still portaging cargoes. And in Sault Ste. Marie, this is actually pretty big business. There's a warehouse at each end of the rapids. There are stevedores who are going to spend a week unloading every single vessel that comes. There are people who have to track all those cargoes within the warehouse. And then, of course, you have people who are having to haul it back and forth on this strap railroad. As you can see, there's actually rail tracks, and they're using horses to pull things back and forth. When they get to the foot of the rapids, now they have to load it onto another boat that's waiting. So there's a nice little economy revolved around loading and unloading boats and moving cargoes. And you figure a week per boat, that's also generating business for the people who own businesses that can serve the ships. In 1838, however, the shipping companies really wanted a lock, and the state of Michigan was willing to build one, and they got approval from Congress to build a lock in 1838. In 1839, they showed up to start building this lock, but nobody had told the Army at Fort Brady that it had been approved. And part of the plan for this new lock is they were going to have to dig through where the Army had its mill race. The Army had a mill within the fort. And of course, they were not in favor of losing their mill and the mill race. And they met the work party with 30 armed soldiers and broke up the work party and prevented any work from getting started. And of course, this is before we have Zoom meetings. It's before we have telephones. And it's even before we have like real roads in Michigan. So it takes months of the correspondence back and forth between the state, between the Department of War, between all of these government agencies until they finally get word to the commander at Fort Brady that this project is approved and you have to allow it to commence. And by that time, the project had kind of imploded on the state side and there was no one to build it anymore. And that was fine with the locals, and it was also fine with this senator from Kentucky. You can see what he had to say about Sault Ste. Marie. And we are remote, but the moon seems a little harsh. Luckily for us at the Soo, maybe not so lucky for the residents who were involved in unloading all the vessels, Millard Fillmore, president, saw it a little bit differently. He maybe wasn't the most famous and revered of all the presidents we've ever had, but I will admit I believe he was definitely right in this, at least, and that a lock at the Soo will be national in its purposes and benefits. So work began in 1853. This is a painting by Robert Thom. He did a whole series of Michigan history paintings, and this is one. And I like to pause here just for a minute to point out all the pink. We're going to look at a lot of photos of excavation, and everything looks gray like concrete. And I challenge you to try to remember that all of that rock is going to be pink like this. And to fund the work, the Congress gave the US Congress, the federal Congress, gave the state of Michigan 750,000 acres of land. That's an area roughly the size of Yosemite National Park. It was land all over the state of Michigan, and the state then sold that land. It had timber, it had mining resources, it was farmland, and the state was able to sell that land at a profit to raise money to finance the building of the lock. This lock finished and opened in 1855. When it opened, it was the largest shipping lock in North America. It's a tandem lock. It was the only one built on site that was a tandem lock, which means there was one lock and then another lock. There are two locks, so it operates like a flight locks. It goes into this first chamber, it's raised 9 feet. Goes into the next chamber, it's raised the next 9 feet. It's kind of a neat design, not nearly as cool as the flight locks on the Welland Canal, which are really impressive, but this was definitely getting the job done. Just a little bit of historic context. You can take a look at what's happening in the world. Last night, I tried to find as many Ohio references as I can. I hope a lot of you are watching from Ohio and will appreciate it. In Ohio, in 1855, the Western College for Women was founded, and it eventually merged with Miami University. And I'll also point out that the Henry Bessemer thing is pretty significant. It kind of revolutionized steel making for a time. The first Bessemer steel mill was installed in Michigan in Wyandotte in the 1860s. And of course, that's going to really fuel the growth of iron ore as a cargo. Another kind of big deal, but probably nobody paid much attention to it in 1855. This little brigantine, the 91-foot long Columbia, carried the first load of taconite through the Soo Locks, through that state lock. It had 132 tons loaded, and that kicked off the whole iron ore movement from Western Lake Superior to the lower lakes. I have some boring graphs. I'm going to try to keep these as short and quick as possible. Main thing I wanted to illustrate is if you look in 1855, iron ore right here, it's almost insignificant, the amount of iron ore that is getting moved. And if you look in 1880 on the other side of that, it's actually the dominant cargo. And you can see kind of how that growth accelerated in the upper chart. And that is continued to be the dominant cargo. So the state lock is operating. This is an image from about 1870. It's running at full capacity during its operating season from April to December, and it is really struggling to keep up. And part of the problem is, of course, the shipping industry is growing, both literally and figuratively. There are more boats being built. There's more boats afloat to haul more goods. And then these boats are also getting bigger. And this lock is only 12 feet deep, and it is only the 350 feet long in each chamber. And just 1 year before that lock opened, this boat was the biggest on the lakes when it launched. The Mississippi is 327 feet long. And I don't know for certain, but chances are this boat was already too big for that state lock. The state lock was 60 feet wide, and it has miter gates. So miter gates are at a V. And so your gates are going to have to be more than 30 feet, and they've got to be able to swing out and swing back. And there's a very good chance at 326 feet, it would not fit. For instance, the MacArthur lock is 800 feet long, and it cannot take a boat more than 730 feet. Here in 1870s, again, we're looking at this picture, and it's an aging lock. It's in constant use. It can't keep up, and Michigan is not in a position to build a new lock at that time. Luckily, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took on the construction of a new lock. They started excavation in 1873, and this lock ended up being built approximately where the MacArthur lock is today. If you have visited the Soo Locks, the MacArthur lock is the one nearest to you when you are in the park or at the observation platform. So they started building this lock in that spot. And here a little group of people has gathered in 1876 to mark the placing of the first stone. This stone, by the way, is in the park. And if you come and visit, you can go and do another selfie there. About a year after the placing of that stone, we have the chamber starting to take shape. You can kind of see the outline of that chamber, and it was wider in the center than it was at the gates, which is why it has this weird little angle there. And we don't have hardly any pictures of the construction of this lock, but this one was one of the pretty good ones. And I do want to point out that this lock is being made with cut stone. So you see all that stone cut, and they're using all these stiff legs to place all the stone to start constructing that chamber. Here the lock, I do not have a picture from the opening of that lock. Don't know if they had a big hoopla or not, but this is a picture from 1891. The lock was finished in 1881, and at that point, the state of Michigan got out of the Soo Locks business for once and for all. They turned the entire facility over to the federal government, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has operated it and managed it ever since. Again, a couple clues I'm gonna keep pointing out to tell if we're looking upstream or downstream is this railroad bridge back here. Whenever we could see the railroad bridge, we're looking west, which is upstream towards the Lake Superior side. And there's sometimes in these glass negatives, the labels were put on the wrong side, so it's reversed. It can be very disorienting, and that railroad bridge has saved me a dozen times when I can't make sense of a picture and I realize, oh, it's backwards. The lock, when it was built, was just called the Lock of 1881, and it was eventually renamed for this man, Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Weitzel. He was the district engineer during its construction. And again, some more historical context. I'd like to point out here, we had 3 presidents in 1881. Rutherford B. Hayes finished his term. James Garfield won election and was inaugurated, then was assassinated, and Chester Arthur finished his term. And 2 of those presidents, Hayes and Garfield, were Ohio natives. And another event in 1881, the Cincinnati Art Museum was founded. Back to the lock, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of construction photos, but we do have some repair photos. And this one is really good. It shows the innovation that the Weitzel lock had, and every lock since has followed this model. If you look at these holes in the floor, this is a wooden floor, and these holes are ports to allow water to flow in and out of the lock chamber to raise or lower vessels. The state lock filled and emptied using sluices in the gate. So they would have a gate, they'd open up a sluice, water would flow through that gate into the chamber. And unfortunately, it would generate a lot of turbulence. It was very hard to control the boats, and there would be a lot of damage to the boats. And by filling from the floor, it's a much calmer, gentler rise. And every single lock since then has been built that way. Another picture of one of my favorites from this series. This is probably about 40 feet below the surface. And if you look, there's these little buoys down here. And I have no idea how they got there, because of course there's no stairs, there's no elevator. There must be a ladder somewhere. And there's all these kids down there on the lock floor. Our safety officer would probably lose his mind. And then the part that even just makes my stomach do flip-flops is all these people just standing on the edge watching. There's no rails, there's nothing. And then another thing I'll mention, and there's a picture coming up where I can show you a little better how busy this lock was. And at this point in 1890, this is the only lock that's operating on the St. Mary's River. And in 1890, this year, they moved over 10,000 vessels. And when we averaged it out over the whole course of their operating season, they were averaging 46 boats through a day. So you've got 46 boats to get through. Of course, that's an average. So sometimes it's going to be more, sometimes it's going to be less. But it's probably a pretty safe bet that it's going to be more in August. This picture was taken August 2nd. So now we've got a backup, and they're fixing this broken valve. 1892, this photo was taken. It has 2 lovely whalebacks, the Samuel Mather towing the barge 110. And this lock is operating at capacity, and just like the state lock, it is not able to keep up. By the end of this year, 1892, they had over 12,000 lockages, and 26,000 passengers had moved through, and they had carried more than 11 million tons of freight. They need a bigger lock to supplement this one. And if you look over in that upper right, if that looks like a construction zone to you, you're right. In 1888, the state lock, it's too small, it's too old, it's too shallow. They stopped using it. And by 1889, they were starting to remove it. The demolition had begun. This picture, November 20, which is my mom's birthday, but not in 1889. She would want me to clarify she was not born in 1889. This photo shows one of the last pictures of that state lock as they were starting to destroy it. And it's the very first picture in the whole series of Pollock construction photos that are in that glass plate collection. This lock that they're going to be building now is on an island because it has the Wetzel Lock south of it, and it's built to the north. So we've got the Wetzel Lock as a waterway. And in the winter, when the Wetzel Lock was closed, they would put in these barges, and they would use those to move goods in and out and to remove the excavated materials and heavy equipment. And I will confess to you, the main reason I have this picture in this presentation is the dog. This dog shows up in a lot of construction photos. And then there's two other dogs that show up in different series and different time periods. And I have to say, I wish we had a Soo Locks dog still. Back to the regular history now that I've indulged my dog fancy. In July 1890, the state lock is gone. And I just want to point out how big of a hole you have to dig to build a lock. You can't just dig the size of your lock and that's where you go. And I also want to point out the date of this picture. This is July 31st, 1890. Those repair pictures we were looking at were August 2nd, 1890. And I want to point out, this is probably when that lock went down or pretty close to it because it was only out for 4 days. And look at all of the masts on the horizon. Those are all backed up traffic waiting for that Wetzel Lock. And back to the Pollock, by 1891, they're ready to place their first stone. And this is just one of many of the safety things that boggles my mind. You'll see that rickety ladder, looks pretty homemade. And then when you zoom in, look at all the ladies that are down there on the lock floor, who I presume went on that rickety ladder. And if you look, there's a lot of little kids, this little boy in his Lord Fauntleroy costume. And look, this one's got a little baby in her arms. I cannot imagine how they got down there to be a part of that moment, but they also then got it immortalized in this photograph. The Pollock, the very first original Pollock, was a mix of horse and steam power. You can see here the horse, that was one of the horses used to move things around inside. Here you see the steam-powered cranes and derricks. Our safety officer would never let us try to recreate this picture. If you look close, you'll see there's men hanging from these cranes. Of course, in 1892 and 1893, when these photos were taken, hard hats weren't even a thing. This lock too was a stone masonry construction. You can see here them starting to place that stone, building that monolith, which is what we call a lock wall. And we had a stone yard where Fort Brady used to be, just below the rapids, below the locks. On the Fort Brady property, there was a pier, and that's where they would unload the vessels that were all loaded with that stone. They used these stiff leg cranes to lift them off and get them where they needed to work on them. And I found a really fun little bit of an Ohio connection to the Soo Locks again. A lot of that stone came from Kelly's Island, Ohio. And I found in our collection these pictures of them loading the vessels there at Kelly's Island. There were some quarry pictures too, but I already confessed to you I'm a boat nerd, so I went with the picture with the boat. Back at Fort Brady, they had a stone planer, and they would dress the stone there and get it into shape and ready to be placed. Then, of course, during the winter, they could use that bridge we saw behind the dog to get the stones into place. But otherwise, they would have to go onto barges and boats and be delivered to the construction site. A photographer was there. They captured the placement of the very last stone here in 1893. But of course, there is still a whole lot of work to be done. They're still got to do all of the floor. This lock also had a wooden floor. And so here these guys are testing the bolts and cutting the bolts. And most of the pictures in the glass plate negative collection are of big things. A lock is a massive machine. They're some of the largest machines on the planet. And So most of the pictures are very big and you don't see the people other than as a comparison for scale. These are some of my favorite pictures because you see the thought, the concentration, the effort of the work that these guys are doing. And if you follow our Facebook page on the Detroit District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and you've seen our winter work pictures, you might recognize that I am definitely biased and that's the kind of pictures that I also like to take. Here they're assembling the gates in place. The gates are huge and we are able to lift them using hydraulic jacks and we have to work on them, but that's a whole different program. I won't get into that. But here they're building the gates in place and then a picture of them after they were done. Again, our safety officer, I don't know why this lady is up there. Today, we're much more safety minded, I suppose. And anytime a gate would be open like this, there'd be a chain and a barricade to make sure no one could step off and fall. I will also point out that these gates on the original Poe lock, were the first on the St. Mary's River to be made of steel. All of the other gates were wooden. This is a picture, you can see the whole chamber. And again, we can see these holes in the floor, which is allowing the water to come in and out of the chamber. The other thing I like to point out right here is the administration building. If you visited us at the Soo Locks, that is the most distinctive building. That's the big gray building with the big tower up at the top. Here it is taking shape, and that is another one of our familiar landmarks that we can use to notice if we're looking upstream or downstream. So if you can see the administration building, we're looking downstream. I also point out up here in the Soo, where it just started to snow about 5 minutes ago. We're pretty tough. We're used to winter weather, but these guys are definitely at the next level, or it was a remarkably warm day. This is a picture from January 1896, and these are not wearing coats. Here's again the administration building. Maybe this looks a little more familiar if you visited us at the Soo Locks. The tower is not fully completed yet, and again, our safety officer would lose his mind. These guys just standing up there. That guy's even got his hands in his pockets. I would be hanging on to something with arms and legs. And then the other one that I find really interesting, this is a construction zone. They're building this building, doesn't have windows, doesn't have glass. They've got barricades across the doors. And there's a little girl right there. There's no grown-ups around her. She's just standing there. And I guess can't even imagine. And another photo we can never recreate, and I don't know who would want to try. This is the peak of the administration building roof. As you'll notice, again, as I said, there are no hard hats yet. That's not a thing. But there's a couple guys holding on to ropes, but otherwise they're all just up there. No fall protection, nothing. This where they are is at least 4 stories off the ground. If you've been to the Soo Locks on Engineers Day, that is the one day of the year that the facility is open to the public. We didn't have it last year because of COVID. We don't know what's going to happen yet this year. But if you have been there, you have hopefully gone into this building. This is a picture I took just a year or 2 ago. As I said, we take it very seriously, trying to protect the historic nature of the facility. And this has all been preserved since it was originally built and maintained. That lock opened in 1896, 800 feet long, 100 feet wide. It was designed to lock 2 boats side by side, and a way to try to make it more efficient. So they could do 4 if they were small enough, or at least 2 boats every time. And other thing I like to point out with this is how with the construction of locks and hydropower plants, the landscape of the river changes dramatically. And here you can see where the rapids are. They're very close to the Poe lock. If you come to visit, you can see the Poe lock. It's the second lock away from you. But the river is still quite a ways away because there's 2 more locks, there's 2 hydropower plants before you reach the rapids. But right then it is much, much closer. This lock was named for, wait for it, another Ohio connection. This is General Orlando M. Poe. He was born in Navarre, I hope I said that correctly, Ohio. And he was a Civil War general. He was the Detroit District Engineer and Commander for 2 different terms. He was also in charge of lighthouses for quite a long time. There's a distinctive style of lighthouse that is named for him. They're Poe-style lighthouses with a giant conical tower and an attached dwelling. There's about, I think, 9 or 12 of them all over the Upper Lakes. He died on an inspection tour in 1895. He was here inspecting the progress on the construction of the lock. He was injured. They did get him back home, and within a month, he passed away from his injuries and ended up being at least remembered and immortalized with the lock named after him. He also has a shoal in the Straits of Mackinac named after him, Poe Reef, and then Poe Reef Lighthouse. A little bit of what's going on in the world. One of the ones maybe most eye-catching to me is George Burns was born in 1896. And another kind of interesting one is in Canton, Ohio. McKinley was running his first front porch campaign as he ran for president. Instead of traveling the country, people came to him, gave a speech to him, he would make some remarks, and they would go away. A quick sidebar, because there is a lock in Canada, and I don't want to completely ignore that. The thing that kind of prompted the construction of the lock in Canada happened in 1870. There was an uprising in Manitoba, and this vessel, the Chicora, was loaded with Canadian soldiers and weapons and ammunition to go to the end of, up to Thunder Bay on the north shore of Lake Superior to get to Manitoba to deal with that uprising. And the state of Michigan, who was operating the lock at that time, contacted the War Department and would not let them pass through. They issued a decree that they had the right to refuse military of any other country passage. And so the Chicora had to tie up on the north shore of the river, unload every bit of military gear and all the military personnel. And then the state lock would still not let them pass through. They were hung up for about 2 weeks with negotiations with the War Department and the federal government and the state of Michigan before they finally allowed the Chicora to pass through. And that just made Canada start to wonder maybe if it wasn't such a good idea to be completely dependent on the US for their passage into Lake Superior. About the same time frame as the construction of the Pollock, beginning in the late 1880s, they started their project. Of course, 1870 to 1880s. It's a big project and it takes a while. And they built their own lock on the north shore of the river. This is a picture of it when it was nearly done. When it opened at 899 feet long, it was the longest lock in the entire world. And it was the very first one in the world to be powered by electricity. It had water turbines, which generated electricity to operate its machinery. This original lock closed in 1987. Part of the wall was collapsing. They managed to stabilize it. And in 1998, they opened a brand new lock inside the original chamber, which you see right here. It's, I like to say it's the cutest little lock you ever saw. It's only 253 feet long and only 9 feet deep. About the biggest boats that can pass through it are the Soo Locks tour boats. Whenever the border opens up again, though, if you have a passport and you're up there, it is definitely worth a visit. It's a great Heritage Canada site. They have a museum there, and you can walk all over the grounds. It's really a beautiful place. Back to the US side of the locks, traffic is continuing to increase. That just seems to be the constant drumbeat. We have 3 locks operating on the river. We have the Wetzel lock right here. We have the original Pollock over here. And of course, on the North Shore, we have the Canadian lock. And we're still struggling to keep up with the traffic. And luckily, got another lock approved. We're not going to replace either of the Wetzel or the Pollock, but we're going to build a brand new one. And the work on that lock, the Davis lock, started in 1907. And what you see there is a team who are getting core samples of the bedrock below the surface. I've been told that we still keep and protect these core samples, and they are kind of a document that can be referred to by engineers if they need to evaluate the bedrock that the lock is built into. And by the late winter, we've got excavation starting. This looks like a pretty slow, painful start to that process. I'll highlight, if you look real close, these guys are using wooden handled shovels, which can't be ergonomically designed at all. There's a horse there to be hooked up and haul their wagons out. It looks pretty miserable. I'm sure that they go home at the end of the day feeling like they deserve more pay. Eventually, they got replaced with steam shovels, which of course made much more progress. And again, we can tell we're looking downstream here because we can see that administration building over there. And here again are those bridges. And this time, these look like pretty rickety bridges. I don't know that I would want to be driving a steam locomotive across them, but it worked. And if you do visit Sault Ste. Marie, I also recommend if you drive by, which you can see here is our hydropower plant, the civilian hydropower plant. It's a really beautiful building of Richardson Romanesque design. It's made with Canal stone. It's a dark pink building, and it's about a 1/4 mile long. I think it's the longest hydropower plant in the world. The Davis Lock, its big innovation was it was the first built with poured concrete. So we had an innovation in the Wetzel with the filling from the floor. We had an innovation with the Pollock building using the steel for the gates. And the Davis Lock was the very first one built on site with concrete, poured concrete. And they built a stone crusher and had their own plant to mix the cement right there on site to have the materials they needed when they needed them. And a couple quick hidden features. I love telling this to visitors who come to see us. Most of what makes up a lock is hidden from sight. It's underwater or it's underground. And these construction photos let us show you some of those hidden features. These are forms for the culverts, and you can see the track these culverts are gonna follow, and the rebar in between where they're gonna pin that concrete. The culverts are what the water flows through, almost like the big pipes. And that's how we're able to move all this water with just gravity and no pumps to change the levels of the water in the lock chamber. This is a close-up. You can see how big these culverts are. So it's moving a lot of water at a time. And we have a view of the Lock Monolith. So if you were to visit us, this is the part you can see. This is the surface, and all of this is underground. And you can see how far out those bases flare out. They're actually 26 feet wide at the bottom. And my son is like a weird engineer thinker guy, and he likes to figure out like impossible, ridiculous math things. And he took all these measurements and figured out that there was enough concrete used to build the Davis Lock to pave a 2-lane road from Sault Ste. Marie to the Mackinac Bridge. And another hidden feature, this is one of the discharge pipes. It's a 5-foot discharge pipe. And this is still in use when we dewater the locks today. We have to use pumps when we take the water below the Lake Huron level, because unless you're at the mystery spot, water doesn't flow uphill. So we use pumps to take the last bit of water out below the Lake Huron level. And we still use this pipe to get that water out. More hidden parts, these are some of the valves. The Davis and Saban locks used butterfly valves to let the water flow in if they were filling it, and to close those and open the ones at the lower end to empty it. Now we use reverse tainter valves, but again, that's a different program, so I won't get into the technicals of that. Here again, our safety officer would probably lose his mind. This guy, it doesn't look like this is even attached yet. I can't tell if it's a suspended load because it doesn't really look like there's much tension on there. And this guy's just crawling around on there. And I will direct your attention to these two guys who are just sitting there. I don't know if they're on their lunch break or what. I have no idea how they got there, but it does not look like a happy, safe place for me to be. And again, I mentioned these are massive machines, some of the biggest machines on the planet. And this kind of gives you an idea of the scale when you see those two guys standing at the base of the Davis Lock and in front of those lower gates. And 1914, we're opening the lock. It's October 21st, and you can see there's a huge crowd there coming to celebrate the completion of this big project. This lock was named for Colonel Charles E.L.B. Davis. He served as the Detroit District Engineer and Commander from 1904 to 1908. He wasn't there for most of the construction, but I presume he was probably incredibly important in getting the congressional support and the funding to proceed with the project and the approvals. A little bit of context there. We've got an Ohio thing right there on the board. the first traffic light installed in Cleveland, Ohio, which of course probably revolutionized the way we drive around in towns and cities. Another Ohio event, the Cooper Tire Company was formed in 1914. And kind of almost like what happened with the Mississippi and the state lock, even while they were building the Davis lock, they started launching boats, which kind of blew up the design. The Davis lock was 1,350 feet long, and the idea was they could lock 3 boats at a time, one after another. And then they're going to get 3 boats through each time. Well, this boat, the W. Grant Morden, is 625 feet long. If you do that math out real quick, even if you're a historian like me and not good at math, you realize that 3 boats are not going to fit in the Davis lock. And it was the biggest one on the lakes until 1926, but it wasn't the only one over 600 feet long. And another thing was happening in 1914. If you look at the back here, looks like another construction zone, doesn't it? And in 1914, they were already building a new lock. The photographer, I would guess, probably got very lucky because they aren't going to have the high-speed cameras like I enjoy or the super wazoo iPhones like my daughters enjoy. But he caught the first blast here of 4,650 pounds of dynamite to start that excavation. And the Saban was an exact twin of the Davis. They were able to build it pretty quickly. They used the exact same plan. They're building it just behind the Davis lock. So they're just about 5 years behind in their progress as the Davis lock is getting built. So everything that they're learning as they build the Davis lock, they are immediately able to apply to building the Saban lock. And I'd like to pause at this just real quick. I love to colorize old photos, and I've never been able to successfully colorize this one. If you remember that painting that we had at the beginning, these big boulders, all of this rock, it's pink. It's like that deep salmon, dusty pink that the Jacobsville sandstone is with white striations. So this would really be very visually striking in person. Again, April 3rd, while everyone else in the world and probably everyone in Ohio is enjoying their daffodils and watching their tulips come up, in Sault Ste. Marie, we're carving up big, huge blocks of ice to move out of the way so we can get to work. Again, I wanted to just point out how wide these are at the base. Here they're backfilling it to bring it up to level with the ground level. And there's these railroad tracks here. There's a little locomotive. It's hauling little wagons full of fill, and they're dumping them in there. And we can tell we're looking downstream because right there's the administration building. And then this is a new building that was built with the Davis building. With the Davis lock. It's called the Davis building. And that's a really particularly wonderful spot because that's where my office is. We're assembling gates again. And again, some of their work is just downright terrifying. We zoom in, this guy's hanging on with just the one hand. This guy's just like leaning there, smiling for a picture. I don't know if this little board here is supposed to be for safety, but it certainly doesn't look terribly sound. Here we are just about a week before the lock is going to open. It looks like a lady standing right on the edge. It's probably about a 50-foot drop there, but okay. The other thing that I want to point out is this Bascule Bridge. This was put in 1913 by the railroad company. And at the time, it was the longest, largest Bascule Bridge in the world. And it's also another one of the features we can look for when we're trying to tell if we're looking up or down. A week after that picture, the lock officially opened. Here's a handful of people came to watch it this time. I presume maybe it was cold, and they're all wearing coats. It's middle of September, which is usually really nice weather, and it's a really small crowd. Lots of boats, not so many people to watch them. This lock was simply called the fourth lock during construction, and it was eventually named for Louis Saban. I don't have a picture of him because I can't find one. He was the designer of the Davis and Saban locks, and he quite literally wrote the book on cement and concrete. That's a picture of his little book you can buy through Amazon or somewhere. I will confess I'm not an engineer type, and I have not made the move to buy this book yet, although I probably should. He served with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 35 years, and for 19 of those, he was the superintendent at the Soo Locks. And he's the only person at the Soo who was not a soldier to have a lock named after him. We've got a bunch of stuff going on. One of the things that I like to point out, during the construction of the Saban lock, so many things out in the world were happening. World War I started and ended. In 1917, we had the pandemic that we are all now very familiar with, that story and the parallels. And the whole time all of that's going on, they are just continually building this lock in the Soo to fulfill their mission. Another Ohio event, I hope there's some people from Toledo. This was the very first matchup between what apparently high school football rivals, Toledo and Bowling Green. Locks are again very busy. Now we have 4 locks in operation. The Wetzel lock has stopped operating, but we have the original Pollock, the Davis lock, the Saban lock, and of course the Canadian lock on the north shore of the river. And here you see boats backed up. This is maybe a little exaggerated because they were hung up with some ice issues, but the locks were constantly busy. One of the coolest cargoes we had, and we never have them anymore, they used to load cars on the decks of the boats, and that's how they would bring cars to the western end of Lake Superior. Between 1937 and 1941, we had over 140,000 cars locked through. And we had lots of people coming to watch. People had always been coming to watch, and you can see quite a crowd here. It's August 25th. It's nice weather, clearly. I don't know how they kept all the people out of the way, but there they are, right outside the door where my office is, watching everybody go by. The tonnage kept going up and down like it always does. A couple times when the things would go low because of the economy was the main driver, they would take the Pollock out of service and they would just use the Davis and Saban. And as the cargo started to pick up towards the end of the 30s, they started talking about replacing the Wetzel lock with a deeper, bigger lock. But it was just talk, and there wasn't a lot of real push to get that accomplished. And then things changed in the whole world. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and almost instantaneously, Sault Ste. Marie changed. This is a picture from September 1939. And if you remember that picture with all the tourists crowding it, September is not as crowded, but you look, there was nobody on the lock complex. Lots of boats, no people. And then when you zoom in, you'll see there's fences now. They have fences out. The public is no longer allowed on the facility. And we now have, this is a soldier standing guard. By November, the fences got taller and they were topped with barbed wire, and there were more soldiers guarding the facility. There were sentry points all over and on the piers with searchlights for security. Between all of the piers, there was barbed wire, and you can see all of those lights. And then way at the back, you can see there's another sentry point. Fort Brady had moved up the hill. It used to be on the waterfront, remember, because they objected to the state building that lock through their mill race. They eventually, in 1892, moved up to the hill, and there were about 200 soldiers stationed there in 1939, and that quickly grew. They added a barrage balloon battalion, and these barrage balloons were put all over around the locks and around town. It was meant to stop like a dive bomber attack. They had these big cables that hung down that would cause them to snag. Thousands of soldiers were brought in, and they were patrolling the locks both on the US and Canadian side. There were anti-aircraft stations, and they had these big 5-foot searchlights. In 1941, in October, so we're not at war, but we have all these military on site, the Bascule Bridge failed, and an engine, a tender, and 35 freight cars went into the river. Unfortunately, the conductor and the engineer who are in that offset picture were trapped in the engine and unable to get out. The brakemen and the firemen were able to swim clear. The military was almost instantly on the scene to investigate because they immediately suspected sabotage. They determined pretty quickly it was a mechanical failure, so luckily it was not an issue of sabotage, but they still had the problem of this bridge broken, locomotive and cars in the river, and now we can't use the two newest locks on the facility, the Davis and the Saban, the deepest locks that are 23 feet deep. We now only have the Canadian lock and the Pollock, and both of those are shallow. The Canadian lock is only 18 feet deep, and the Pollock is only 21 feet deep. There are a lot of boats that are now stuck. They are not able to move because they're loaded too deeply or their draft is too deep to fit in either of those locks. There were 50 boats waiting by the second day. 4 days later, they did use a tug. They were able to remove the cars and the tender and the engine and get those canals open. Less than 2 months later, Pearl Harbor is attacked and the US is fully into World War II, and the Soo Lock protection moves up another notch. In 1942, they established a vital defense zone around the Soo Locks, which included most of Chippewa County, which is that little black circle you see there. They built airstrips at Rayco and in Kinross. The one at Kinross is now our regional airport. And then they eventually extended that vital defense zone to wrong slide. They extended it 150 miles, incorporating much of the upper part of Michigan and the eastern UP, part of Canada. And in Canada, they established these radar stations. And these radar stations are in a kind of rough half arc around the Soo Locks, with the Soo Locks at its base. And they were meant to detect any aircraft that might be brought in through the Hudson Bay to try and attack the Soo Locks. There were, at the peak of the military activity here, there were 12,000 soldiers stationed here. This is pretty dramatic if you consider that at the time, the population of Sault Ste. Marie was 6,000 people. So twice the population was brought in soldiers. This was a photo taken during a parade downtown for Army Day. Oops, went the wrong way. And so in other World War II news, you remember they had been talking about replacing the Wetzel lock. Well, now they have a pretty big incentive to do it. In March 1942, Congress approved the lock and they began funding it. By June 8th, when this photo was taken, they have the upper end dewatered. They've removed all the water from it. You can see they're still using the gates here. And they're starting to remove that Wetzel lock, that 1881 lock. Now, this lock was built in lightning speed, and I mean lightning speed. This is pictures June 1942. This lock is going to open on July 11th, 1943. They were able to do this partly because they were doing multiple things all at one time. Instead of getting all the crib dams in place and then dewatering the entire site and then starting excavation, they're still installing the crib dams at the bottom. And they're already excavating inside the chamber. They were dewatering it in sections and just getting going on it. We've covered a lot of construction photos. I'm going to hit a couple that I think are kind of remarkable. This one, I wonder how in the world the people who worked in the administration building got to the administration building, and I can't imagine what the noise must have been like. It's also kind of surprising to me how close they are to the foundations of the administration building. And of course, our safety officer would probably have some issues with this guy just right on the edge, no fall protection, just happily jackhammering away. Another one that really caught my eye, there's a boat right here. This, as near as I can tell, is in the Pollock. So the next lock right next to this Wetzel lock they're removing. And they're blasting. They're blowing up charges of dynamite with a boat right there. I'm pretty sure we would not be using dynamite quite that way. By August, so remember we saw that picture in June, they were dewatering and starting to remove that lock. By August, they're starting to work on the pier walls. They're building those forms and starting to place concrete. And of course, they're still excavating at the lower end. And a few weeks later, they've come back and they're filled in the gaps between the sections they already poured. And now they're starting on the next layer of the pier wall. We had some colorful safety signs. These were just too charming to leave out. We have a lot of safety signs around the Soo Locks right now because safety is a top priority, but none of ours are as colorful as this. They were working on this lock year round, 24 hours a day. So even in winter, they were still placing concrete into these monoliths to form the walls. And what they would do, they would build the form and then they would build a heated shelter over top of it. And they would keep that heated so that the concrete could cure. Now this created its own problems because sometimes these forms would end up catching on fire, which then of course are setting your work back. And so they took it pretty seriously. I don't know if you can read this on your screens, but there are signs all over that said danger, watch for fires, fires help the axis. So again, it's reinforcing that it's your patriotic duty to be safe and make sure the work progresses. This is a snapshot of the progress as of April 10th, 1943. Now, remember, we're going to open in July. And this is the nose pier. Whenever we build a new lock, we got to fix the piers so that they keep up with the technology and the dimensions. And you'll see here's one of these barrage balloons. These were a pretty interesting novelty when they arrived, but the citizens of Sault Ste. Marie pretty quickly got sick of them. They were filled with hydrogen, so they were extremely flammable. And they had a tendency to break loose and end up where they shouldn't be. There was one that broke loose and it was over near a grocery store and it exploded and blasted all the windows out of that grocery store. So they were pretty happy to see the last of those. This is the same day. So we're looking at the nose pier and all this excavation that's still happening. And meanwhile, at the upper end, they've got the sills in place, the debris pits, which is right here. And this is the sill, and they're starting to build the upper gates. Here's another view of that. A few weeks later, the gates are getting a little bigger. But meanwhile, if you look in between here, you're seeing they're still building forms for the monolith down there, and it kind of looks like just a bunch of mess down there. This photo is the same day. So this is on the other side of those gates we were looking at. And you can see they're in quite a different phase of construction at this point. And they're still excavating in the approach canal. Here we are in mid-May. Remember, we're opening July 11th. Mid-May, we're still building forms and placing concrete. And this is within the lock chamber because there's our upper gates. And so we're still placing concrete to form that lock chamber. Same day, they're still looking downstream. They're working on the floor. The floor is getting a little closer to done. This is June 10th. We have 1 month and 1 day until we're going to be putting a boat through this lock. And if you look at that floor, you can see the filling and emptying ports. That's where the water comes in and out from the culverts built into the lock wall. And here we are at June 26th, and they're bringing the last load of concrete. Now, the park was closed during all of World War II. So I presume that this is probably an office lady who came out to watch the last load because apparently this looked like it was quite a big deal. They've got the truck all decorated up and all the guys wanted to be in the picture of it. And we have the placement of the last load. And we got probably one of the engineer bosses out here in their nice hats to watch the placement of that last load. We're about 16 days from the lock officially opening. And here, June 30th, we're starting to fill it. That concrete was placed 4 days ago. I hope it was in a place where it doesn't matter about the getting wet for it to cure. And here we are, July 11th, 1943. Carl D. Bradley is the longest ship on the Great Lakes at the time. And she was the first lockage through this brand new lock. The Bradley at that time was 640 feet long. And I will also freely confess to you, this is a colorized photo This is not, it's based on an actual real black and white photo, but I found a software that let me make it these beautiful tints, and since it was a happy day and a happy picture of a really tragic vessel, I wanted to use this color. And I will point out, this lock was built in lightning speed. Lightning speed. They built it in just 13 months from the photos that we were looking at from June to July. And it was 24-hour-a-day construction, 7 days a week. It was during World War II, and it cost twice as much as the budgeted cost. It was named for General Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur was not ever a Detroit district commander, but he started his career as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he was the kind of the hero of the day, and it seemed appropriate to them to name the lock after him. We've got lots of stuff going on. As you can tell from this, we are still fighting in World War II. We're fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And in Cleveland, Ohio, the first Joann store opened in 1943. Again, cargoes are still up and down. In 1943, after the success of the MacArthur lock, despite it being double its budgeted cost, Congress approved building another lock to replace the original Pollock. Of course, they approved it, wasn't funded. That's a situation that we were very used to in the Corps of Engineers, but it had been approved. And finally, when you're patient, sometimes things happen. This photo in 1961 was one of the last photos taken of the original Pollock before it was removed. The Pollock, because it was so small and so shallow, it was decommissioned, which means we only retain it as a water retention device. It was never used again as an operating lock after 1955. And this is one of the last photos. They were going to remove it to build a 1,000 foot long, 100 foot wide, 32 foot deep lock. They start building those crib dams to make the dry workspace. They start digging. If you'll notice, of course, you need a much bigger hole than your lock. Over here is the wall for that chamber of the original Pollock. And of course, they're digging way over here. And by March 26th, they have a much bigger hole. And you can see that we have a new train bridge. We got a new Bascule train bridge when they built the Davis and Saban locks. And we got this new aerial lift bridge when they were building the Pollock. In June, they were taking core samples to get a record of that bedrock that the lock was going to be built on. And if you come to the park, you can see one of those samples, and you can see that pink stone. So like when we saw those excavation pictures, this is the color that stone would have been. It's this really deep pink and white. It's really kind of lovely stone. And you come to the park, you can get a selfie with it. In September 1962, most of the excavation is finished, and they are ready to start the next phase of building this 1,000 foot long lock. Except they have to stop construction and flood the work site to redesign it for the 1,000 foot long, 105 foot wide boats in the works for several Great Lakes fleets. Their 1,000 foot long lock that's 100 feet wide is not going to work. So after much work and redesigning in 1964, August 7th, they had a little hoopla celebration, and these two men pushed the button to start the pumps so they could begin the work to build a 1,200 foot long, 110 foot wide lock. In August 1964, they're also building a new pier. They have to extend that nose pier out here. And I'll tell you, that is a very long pier. I don't want to tempt your or test your patience, but I have friends on boats, and one of my friends is a deckhand. I won't name any names. And he was put off on the pier to walk his boat in. So he walks his boat in. He sends me a message. I go out and wave to him, and then he sends me a message as the boat's leaving that he thinks he dropped his wallet on the pier. Could I please go take a look for it? And of course, I'm a nice person, so I said, sure. And I put on all my gear. It's about 10 degrees outside. The wind is probably at least 10, 15 miles an hour. And I walk the entire length of this pier looking for his wallet, which I did not find. I turned and went back, walking right into the teeth of the wind. I get back to my desk and I look, and I have a message from him that he had found it. It was in his other pants. This is a nice aerial view. You can see how big of a hole you need. And over here, we're having that raw materials for the cement mixer plant to be able to make the concrete as we need it. Again, this lock is being constructed on an island, just like the original Lock. And so all of the excavated materials have to be loaded into dump trucks and then loaded into barges and then hauled away. There's a picture of the mixing plant, and they had kind of a little makeshift dock on the crib dam to allow the boats to come in and bring the raw materials for that. This is one of my favorite comical pictures. The caption says, this is the second pour for the new Lock. And apparently they missed the first pour, because right here is the first pour. And so I'm at least happy they got that historic second pour. This picture is taken in September '66. I wish I knew who took it and I could thank them if they are still with us, because this is one of the most useful pictures that we have to try to explain to people how the locks work. This is the Lock Monolith in a side view. And what you see in this big opening here, there's alternating sections, so this would all be connected. That is the culvert. There's one on each side of the lock wall, you can see. And if you compare the size of that culvert with that dump truck, you get an idea of how big that culvert is. In the Lock, when we open the valves and we allow the water to flow out, we move 1 million gallons of water a minute. That's because we have these gigantic culverts. It's all moved from gravity. Water only ever flows from Lake Superior to Lake Huron, and it's just gravity that is moving it through these culverts. In May '67, they're setting rebar for the laterals. The laterals are connected to those culverts in the Lock Monolith, and so the water flows into these culverts. You see the opening right there. And each of them has a series of these little openings all throughout it. So the water actually is flowing in through here, and then that's what's rising the boat in the lock. And here we are in August '67, and you can see the emptying ports. At the upper end, there are filling ports. So the water goes into the culverts through these filling ports. It travels through the culvert. It comes out into the laterals. When they're filling the chamber, when they're emptying the chamber, it flows out of the laterals into the culvert and down out of these emptying ports. We have a nice aerial view. You can see they're still using crib dams in June 1967 to have a dry work area. These stop logs are a temporary dam. They're like bulkheads, and they fit into slots in the lock wall. If you've followed our Facebook winter work posts, then you've seen these many times, I'm sure. And then down here is our cement mixer plant, and there you can see these laterals that are taking shape within the lock floor. Here we are in October '67. In just that short amount of time, they have removed the crib dams, and they're using those stop logs as a temporary dam to hold the water out. And at the lower end, they're using guard gates, which are mitered gates that water pressure holds closed to form a temporary dam as they're finishing up the lock. And then in 1968, and this is August, they start filling the lock, which is, of course, the very first test of a new lock. This is a pretty exciting process when they do it this way. We used to do it this way every winter, but now we don't, sadly. We have a much more boring and probably safe way of doing it. But if you'll notice on the other side of the lock canal, look at all the people who've come to watch. So this is clearly a very big deal. And they're filling it up to see and make sure it all works. The water goes where it's supposed to, and that they're able to move it as they need to with operating the valves. The second test was the passage of the Philip R. Clark fully loaded. And it was the first time they ran a loaded vessel through. Now, one of the shocking things to me, so this is October 1968, they test the lock, it all works beautifully, and then they let it sit. It sat for almost 9 months. After that lockage of the Clark, they did not use it again because they wanted to have an official grand opening in conjunction with events at the Welland Canal in June 1969. And for anybody else who's a boat nerd out there, I will direct your attention here, to this boat right here. You probably recognize it as the Ryerson. Some people would argue the prettiest boat on the Great Lakes. So we've made it to the 9 months or so later, and the Philip R. Clark got to also be the first boat to open the Pollock. So we're in June 1969, and we are officially opening the Pollock. There was quite a hoopla and a to-do. There were some bands. There was a little parade. The governor of Michigan was there. There were several congressmen who came and gave speeches. And as far as I'm concerned, though, the most noted dignitary and the most interesting of the dignitaries is this guy right up here in the pilot house. That is Captain Tom Small. He was a retired captain from the Great Lakes, and he, believe it or not, had been aboard the first freighter to enter the original Pollock in 1896. So he was on board as a deckhand in 1896, the boat that opened the Pollock, the original Pollock in 1896. And in 1968, they brought him back. He was the honorary captain of the Philip R. Clark to open up the second Pollock. Way better than a congressman's speech, in my opinion. This lock also was named for Orlando Poe. And of course, these events are a little more concurrent with us, and probably things we all remember. In Ohio, Wendy's was founded, which is also a pretty interesting thing to have come out of Ohio. And another event that I like and near and dear to my heart is also the Soo Locks Park Ranger turned 1 year old in 1969. There's two ways of calculating the age of the Pollock. The old way was when it was finished with its construction in 1968. And then there's a new way where they go by when it officially opened in 1969. I personally like the 1968 version because then me and the lock are the same age and it's just much easier. And I have a whole series of good jokes that I can make with visitors when the lock is my age. So here we are with our current configuration. And I have this little quote I've set out here. It's a paraphrase from Kurt Vonnegut. And he said that science fiction is about the past and history is about the future. And I think there's some truth in that. We study the past to understand the present and to plan for the future. And we are still living history today. Here we still have ups and downs, mostly still based on things like weather, the economy, and infrastructure beyond our own. For instance, here in 2015 and 16, there was some real struggles with having enough rolling stock on the railroads to be able to move taconite from the mines and the taconite mills to the docks to get it onto boats. We continue to set new records. The Indiana Harbor, it wasn't in this trip, but the Indiana Harbor in 2019 carried the largest single load ever through the Soo Locks. She carried 77,543 tons in a single load. And I call this section Living History because we are living through history. All of this stuff is happening again. In 1986, a new lock was approved. It wasn't funded, it was approved. In 2009, some preliminary work was funded, and we installed these cofferdams at each end of that Saban lock. We did work on the lower approach canal. And then in 2020, last year, work was funded and work began in earnest, deepening this approach here to make it the new project depth. If you may recall, the Davis and Saban locks are only 23 feet deep. The new project depth for the river in this area is 30 feet. So they have to excavate or dredge all of that material out to get to the new project depth. This year, they're going to be starting that work on the piers. They're going to be working on those piers from 1919 to get them up to code for what is needed for the modern vessels. And then in 2023, if not sooner, they expect to be starting to remove the Saban lock. They're going to be filling in the Davis lock with that excavated material and those what they remove. And then they're going to be starting lock construction. Currently, they have a target date of 2030 or sooner to be putting that first lock through. I can assume that we will also have the big crowds on hand. I don't know if there will be speeches from governors and congressmen, but it seems pretty likely. And there will be a lot of hoopla again. I hope you've enjoyed this. There is the link to the glass plate negative collection if you are interested in searching that to kind of explore those images yourself. It's a great arrangement on the Clark Historical Library's webpage. And I think Carrie will have the questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was
exhausting.
No.
It was exhausting.
No, not at all. We've had quite a few questions. I had to make a few notes because they were being asked during a certain point, so I can hopefully get back to them. The very first one, which I think is a really nice question too, which is what is the definition of a lock? If you can just, I mean, we know how they work, but what is it that sort of defines it?
Well, you know, the way I like to define it when I'm talking to visitors, and the clearest way to kind of explain it, it is an elevator for boats. So basically, it's a canal with an elevator in the middle to bypass a waterfall.
Okay.
So when you go into this, the chamber, you get your boat in, they close it up behind you, they pull the plug and drain the water to lower you to the Lake Huron level. They do it in reverse. When you go into from the Lake Huron level into the lock chamber, they close that gate behind you. They close the valve that would let the water out. They open a valve at the upper end that just lets the water flow in from Lake Superior, which is 21 feet higher. And then it just rises, and there you go to the next level.
Right.
It's a gravity operated elevator for boats.
Oh, I like that. I'll have to remember that one myself. A gravity operated water elevator for boats. All right.
Yep.
Dawn asked at like 7:20. So you were discussing the 1881 some time frame.
Yep.
He was wondering, he seemed surprised that they were semi-refining taconite at that early time period.
They were not.
Oh,
they
okay.
were not using taconite at that point. If I said taconite, I apologize. It was iron ore. It would have been raw ore.
And this one I didn't catch the time. Dennis wanted to know why the smaller openings at both gates of the Weitzel lock, also the curve in the lock opening is opposite at both ends.
Brilliant. I'm glad someone noticed that. The Weitzel lock and the Pollock, the original Pollock, were both designed to lock boats side by side. So what the intent was is they only need the narrow entry because they're only going to move one boat in at a time. They're going to bring one boat in, it's going to park over, it's going to tie up on the right. They're going to bring the other boat in, it's going to tie up on the left. So they could lock boats side by side. So since they're only moving one at a time, you don't need that wide, you don't need to make your gates any bigger. And the Weitzel lock had wooden gates. So I imagine that it's much easier to operate a smaller gate. And then you have the nice big chamber to get more boats in.
Okay. Paula had a couple of things. She definitely agrees that you need a Soo Locks dog. And then again, this was building, and I did not write down the date here, but I'm sure it's building all of these locks. You know, who are all these actual workers? Are they locals? Are they people the Army is bringing in? Like, how are they managing all this people?
It's a mix of contractors and Corps of Engineers. A lot of the guys you're seeing on shovels and on the cranes and all of that, especially as we get into the more modern era, those are contractors. And even now, the people that are working on the new lock, the people doing the dredging, actually digging the holes in the river, are contractors. But there is a whole team of Corps of Engineers employees. There's engineers, contract specialists, all kinds of technicians who oversee all of the work that's going on. Okay. And do the design and the planning.
So when you say contractors, I mean, again, hopefully local people, that's great.
We have to go through the federal system. So there's a whole range. I think the company that is doing the dredging right now is actually coming out of New Mexico. Okay. And they were the ones that won the bid. It has to be an American company. And I mean, there's all these criteria and you have to demonstrate you're qualified, but they do seem to be subcontracting a lot of local people.
I had somebody ask a question anonymously, but I think it's pretty good. I mean, we saw all these pictures of these people with no safety gear. How many recorded deaths are there of workers throughout all of these different locks during the?
I will say just as the safety seemed pretty hit and miss, so was the record keeping.
Well, yeah, I figure that much.
I mean, there's a series of pictures of the MacArthur Lock construction that I've been through where from the labels, it's pretty clear there was some sort of a fatality. And there's all these pictures that are showing, but it never says how many people, what happened. It's very, I mean, a lot of times these pictures raise more questions than they answer. And you're just like, what?
All right, I have a kind of a all-in-one question from Mark, and this is when we were talking right around just before and during World War II. Was there any consultation between the U.S. and Canada during construction? So this, I guess, kind of got three parts to it here. And we talked a lot about, and I knew about, you know, all the military guarding of the locks during World War II, but what about during World War I? And then finally, because they were doing some building in 41 and 42, were they using any, as Mark says, prisoners of war or undesirables, meaning Eastern Europeans, Poles, and Ukrainians in the construction?
I have no idea. The first part, the lock had been approved before the war kind of came up. I mean, at least it had been talked about. And like even with our new lock, there's not really any formal like consultation with Canada, like, hey, we were going to do this. What do you think? We just do. We have a lot of partnership with Canada, and I will say the military aspect of that during World War II is very evident because we initially were also providing soldiers to guard the Canadian lock until they could get forces deployed there. So there was a lot of cooperation in the protection of the facility, both the Canadian lock and ours. And there were soldiers in both. And also, if you may have recalled in that graphic we had, Canada put the radar bases there to protect the Soo Locks. So, I mean, there's a lot of cooperation, and actually there still is. And I mentioned, you know, we're building a new lock. I don't know that there was any formal, you know, it wasn't like Canada had to sign off on it, but we still have a lot of partnership with them. And even like one of the best examples of that is how we handle ice breaking on the Great Lakes. Ice breaking is very much a partnership between the U.S. and the Canadian Coast Guards.
Okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling.
Not sure if I hit all of that, but
no, that's okay. Like we had a few during the thing, and now the questions are rolling in, so I'm trying to. So we might go back and forth a little bit here as I do this. Troy wants to know when, and again, we understand that there's a question about it for this year. When is traditionally Engineers Day? Because everybody
traditionally Engineers Day is the last Friday in June.
Okay.
So, and it's every year, last Friday in June.
Okay.
And it was canceled last year because of COVID, and they have not made a decision yet this year because, of course, we have a lot of factors to consider. I think right now, currently, there's a limit of 1,000 people for an outdoor event in Michigan, and Engineers Day draws up to 10,000 people in a day.
Okay.
We'll have 10,000 people on our facility between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. And we're, you know, there's a lot to figure. If the restrictions stay where they are, there's a lot to try to figure out how to manage that in a way that is responsible and in compliance with federal and state regulations.
I agree. George wants to know, kind of along with that, how close can visitors get to a lock?
Visitors can get within about 20 feet of a lock on a normal day. I keep defaulting to grab my mouse to show my slide. There's still things on the slide. The observation platforms are right on the edge of the MacArthur Lock. So if you are at the visitor center or in the park, you can stand in the observation platform and you can talk to the deckhands that are on board the vessels as they lock through. I like to say it's the closest you'll ever get to a Great Lakes freighter without getting on board for most people.
Oh, wow.
You are literally, you can have a conversation with a deckhand on board.
Well, that's a good way to go. All right, sorry, I'm just losing my mouse here. This is kind of, again, these are two questions from Douglas and then somebody else that kind of go together. Oh, kind of Kenneth. which is sort of this chicken or egg question. Does the size of the locks define the boat dimensions or vice versa? And I think that comes from as they were building this last lock that all of a sudden they had to redesign. And so is that yeah, it's just sort of which comes first.
It used to be kind of the boat size dictated locks. They would build bigger boats and push the Corps into having to make bigger locks. With the Pollock, the 1,200 foot long lock, that has stopped. That has stopped because there's lots of people who had thought the new lock is going to be a super lock. It's going to be even bigger. And no, it's not. It's going to be the exact same size as the Pollock, because what we look at from a national security standpoint, which I forgot to mention with that bridge accident, the Soo Locks and why there are all those guards, 100% of our domestic iron ore supply today is flowing on boats through the Soo Locks. So 100% of the iron ore that we mine in the US is coming out of the Mesabi Range in Minnesota and the western UP of Michigan. And the Soo Locks that's the only way to get it from those places to the mills on the lower lakes to turn it into steel. So that's why there are guards. That's why there were so many soldiers here, because of that taconite. And what we have now, there's only a handful of boats in the American fleet that fit in the MacArthur Lock. The MacArthur Lock currently can't take any boat longer than 730 feet long and 76 feet wide. Of course, then we have 13,000 foot long boats. We have a lot of boats that are 858 more. We have lots of them that are 740 feet long, and they cannot go in the MacArthur Lock. So we have almost the entire fleet and much of the Canadian fleet now, which are entirely dependent on one lock. They only fit in the Pollock. If something goes wrong with the Pollock, it shuts down.
Right, shuts down.
And the impact to the steel mills it could be catastrophic, because the steel mill isn't like, you can't just turn off a light switch and wait till you get more supplies. So we had a critical time in 2014 when we had that awful winter, and it took 9 days for a boat to get across Lake Superior. It usually takes 28 hours, and the mills were almost out. They were like within, I think it was 24 hours of being out of raw materials because of the trouble with the boats being able to get through that ice. Well, imagine that now with the Pollock out of service. Okay. So part of the main reason we want to build and are building the second size lock is for that redundancy. Now, if you work in business and they say you're redundant, that's a bad thing. If you're in the military, and we are part of the Army, you want redundancy. So we want 2 locks that can take those boats. So one thing too, if you follow our Facebook, you'll see that winter work is brutal. I actually have a whole program about winter work and how brutal it is. It's Sault Ste. Marie in January, 20 degrees below zero with the wind blowing is not when you want to work outside in the ice and snow and water to maintain a lock that is now 52 years old. So if we have another size lock, that lets us do more maintenance on the current Pollock when we have some nice weather.
Right. This is just an aside, nothing to answer, but from Mark again, who was asking about World War II. And he said there was which I did not know, there was a prisoner of war camp near the Sioux during the First and Second World Wars. So that's kind of where the genesis of that question was. Mm-hmm.
I doubt, given the fact that once World War II, actually even before World War II started in 1939, Sault Ste. Marie became a military district. Mm-hmm. And the fences went up and the public was not allowed in the park. I kind of doubt they would have allowed prisoners of war near that kind of, the Army classifies the Soo Locks as critical infrastructure. Okay. And I kind of doubt they'd have let anyone not American near it.
So, and again, we keep coming back to this the building that they're doing before and during the World War II time, sort of asking about how did they have enough people to build it? Basically, here's the question. During the war, were the men working on the locks excluded from the draft? And
no.
If not,
well, yes.
Did you have women help building on those?
The men who were building the lock were exempt from the draft.
Okay.
Because they were doing what was considered war essential work. It was the same kind of situation in southern Lake Michigan, where they were building the Navy vessels.
Okay.
So your Navy shipyards had young, able-bodied men. They were not subject to the draft.
Okay. There's a couple of questions again that kind of go back and forth together. Sort of asking about lake levels, especially, you know, within the last year, the, you know, lake levels are up 3+ feet in Lake Huron. And how does that affect how the locks work, or does it?
For the most part, it does not. No matter how deep the water is, we're basically moving 21 feet, at least between Whitefish Bay, where Lake Superior empties into the river, and Lake Huron down by Detour. It's pretty consistent what the difference in that depth is. Now, a difference that I've seen myself working here since 2009, when the water levels were low, if you'd get a big storm and you'd have waves washing up on the upper gates, you could still cross and not get soaked. But now, with the water levels so high, those waves start washing over the gates, and so sometimes they're not really safe to walk across or comfortable to walk across. But so far, it's not overtopped our gates. Sometimes when we get a seiche, which is a change in water pressure that makes the water go up suddenly, it will wash over our gates. It doesn't do any damage to them. It's just inconvenient if you need to get across and it's time for you to go home.
Right. So I'm going to ask one of those sort of tough questions, but I think sometimes they need to be asked, and it's not tough on you. It's just, you know, you're talking about importance versus other things. Bruce is asking, what are the environmental effects of building these locks, especially on wildlife, for example, whitefish spawning and those kinds of things?
Well, I'm kind of glad that he asked that. As you may have noticed from when we show those excavations and you see the approach canals, it's like all like concrete. And then we've got the rapids at the upper end, on the north. Mm-hmm. And what usually happens, I have actually a little exhibit in the observation platform that says, do the fish lock through too? And for the most part, sometimes fish go through, but for the most part, the fish are going to just kind of gravitate towards their natural habitat. So they kind of skirt around the locks. And then at the rapids, there's a compensating works that goes across it, which is controlling the flow for the hydropower plants. But there is a fish pass there.
Oh, cool.
And then we just did this huge project through Engineering with Nature, where those compensating works were built in like the 19-teens through 1920. And to raise those gates to change and regulate the water levels, we can't really change the water levels, but to regulate it, they have to hand turn it. And it takes two guys at each end on this huge section. They're raising this huge bulkhead, and they've got to do it perfectly in sync so they don't get it cattywampus and jammed. So they have to do it perfectly in sync, and it takes them about 15 to 20 minutes, which of course then sends a wall of water down the rapids because it's raising so quick, which then washes away the fry. And then the reverse almost happens when they have to close the gates, because then all of a sudden there's no water, and then it harms the fish. Just about 3 years ago, I lose track now. I've been here so long where I'm one of those ladies who's like, back in my day. But
yep, I got
it. We automated those gates now. And so they're automated, and they can open just fractions of an inch at a time. So they can actually go over 24 hours or longer to very slowly adjust that water level, so we don't have a wall of water that washes away the fish and the fry and the eggs, and so that the water doesn't suddenly disappear, so that the fish have a chance to adapt and move and relocate. And then it doesn't have a dramatic change of water level. Okay. So we are actually cooperating to help the fish, and we even trap sea lampreys at our power plants because we don't want to help them.
No, let's get rid of those. Ron wants to know, and I maybe you said this and I missed it as well, but how long does it take to fill the chamber and lift the boat 20 feet, 21 feet?
It takes about, I did not say, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say that. It takes about 20 minutes. It takes 22 million gallons of water to raise a boat 21 feet in the Pollock, and we move about 1 million gallons a minute. So it takes about 20 minutes. The slowest part of the whole process, if you come to watch, It usually takes about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. And the longest part is the boat coming into the lock. And what I always like to tell people, they come in at walking speed because they don't build them with brakes.
Yeah, exactly.
So they have to come in very slow and they get tied up, and then that's when we can start raising them. And if you come to the Soo Locks and watch, you can actually see the rise. I mean, it doesn't happen like super fast, but if you watch, you can actually see that the boat is rising. And if you take a Soo Locks boat tour, you can feel it. It kind of feels like when you're in an elevator.
Oh, okay, cool.
Because it is a gravity operated elevator.
Exactly. Ron wants to know, can he take his 23-foot sailboat through the locks? And then he's also asking about costs. But I think the fun question here is, what does it take a personal vessel through it?
Those are two good ones that I like to always address with people. First off, does Ron's sailboat have a motor? We do not let anybody sail into the lock. Every boat that we allow in the locks on the US side has to be self-powered. So you have to have a motor. Okay. And we do not allow skidoos or jet skis or anything like that. It's quite often up to the chief lockmaster who does the dispatching. If a boat is small enough to be trailered, the lockmaster may deny lockage. But a private recreational vehicle is certainly eligible if it is self-propelled, and they should have 75 feet of line on board so that they can be tied to the dock. You would call the lockmaster either on cell phone or marine band radio to request permission. You are going to be last in line if there are more boats, because our hierarchy is government vessels first. So that's Coast Guard, Corps of Engineers vessels, Customs and Border Patrol, then commercial cargo carriers, then commercial boats, which would be like tugboats and Soo Locks tour boats, and then private recreational watercraft. And if his sailboat is really small, or he has a jet ski or a kayak or a canoe he really wants to take through a lock, you can do that on the Canadian side.
Okay, that's what I was just going to ask, is what about the Canadian one? Because I know it's so much smaller.
Yep, the Canadian one will do kayaks and canoes and small boats. They'll do jet skis. And also there's no charge. Oh. There's no charge for Ron, and there's no charge for the Paul R. Tregurtha, the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. This is part of the federal transportation system. All the freighters pay cargo taxes on everything that they haul. Their cargo taxes go into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and then we get operating funds from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Okay. So it's kind of like the way you fund the interstate, the way I-75 gets paid for.
Right.
We're all paying.
I'm going to do 2 more here. There's still a few left in the queue, but I think what I would like to do, Michelle, is send those to you, and if you'd be willing over the next couple of days to maybe type out a few answers for them.
Sure.
And I can get them off to everybody, because, I mean, we're headed towards the end of the evening here. I had somebody ask, and again, I don't know anything about this, so that's one of the reasons I picked it. Could you mention the power canal through town?
Cool. Yeah. It's a power canal. There is a treaty from 1910 between the US and Canada, which regulates the water. The US gets 50% of it and Canada gets 50% of it, which is part of what that compensating works is. I like to always tell, especially when I have like a middle school age group of kids on a tour or a Q&A, that the entire St. Mary's River is dammed, because there are hydropower plants, there are the compensating works. Each lock is actually a dam, and because it's a water retention device, our operators are called lock and dam operators. And the part of the US ration is going to that power canal, which is going to the civilian power plant downstream. That power plant was built in 1902. It's a 1/4 mile long. It's a really impressive building. In normal times, it's one of those phrases we all say now, back in normal times, during Engineers Day, that building was open to the public, and they would give out hot dogs and popcorn on Engineers Day. And it's really impressive. It's gorgeous. And that power canal is the source of its energy.
Okay.
It loses about 2 feet of head in the canal. So it's not as efficient as our power plant, which went online in 1952, but It's still a mainstay of the Eastern UP's power grid.
Excellent. And I want to end with this one because I think this is nice. What is your favorite part of working at the locks?
I'm not going to pick one. I'm going to pick two.
Okay.
My first part is being so close to the boats and being able to take pictures of them and getting to kind of make friendships with people on the boats. And then my second is so many of the guys that I work with, the lock and dam operators. And I mean, these guys work 24 hours a day. The chief lock masters, they work 24 hours a day. I should say shifts. They work a 12-hour shift, 7 to 7. And whether it's raining, it's hail, whether it is snowing and ice, they are locking boats 24 hours a day. If a boat gets to the lock, it goes through. And these guys earn every penny of their pay when this weather is miserable. I mean, there's times where it's 20-mile-an-hour winds and it's just like spitting snow, you know, that painful snow that hits your face and stings. And they, you know, you can't walk a boat in backwards to get out of the wind.
Yeah.
There's nothing to do, but you just do it. And I mean, they're just fantastic. I admire the work that they do, and I'm also really grateful that they're so kind at explaining to me all of the work that they do. Because I'm a historian. I'm not an engineer, and the only reason I know so much about what I was able to tell you is because all these other nice people told me when I tested them with questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Michelle. This has been stunning. Just, I mean, really informative and interesting. You obviously love what you do. Enjoy.
I do. And I'm so sorry it took so long. I was trying to like cut slides everywhere and trying to talk faster, and then I couldn't breathe.
We still have a lot of people here. And so I do want to let everybody know that is still here. Don't forget, we have one more in our extended spring lecture series, which will be on May 12th. We're going to have Chris Winters, who's a historian and photographer, and will present St. Mary's Challenger Centennial, a sequel. This is going to highlight the history of the Challenger over the 100. It sailed for over 100 years and is actually technically still working today. And after Chris talks, we're going to be joined by our executive director, Chris Gilchrist, who's going to outline some of the plans that we have at the National Museum of the Great Lakes to install the pilot house from the St. Mary's Challenger to the grounds of the National Museum of the Great Lakes and become part of our exhibit features. Chris Winters does have a really beautiful hardcover book about his time he got to spend aboard the Challenger and its century of work, and that is available for sale through the Eventbrite. And I know we've had this in past because I get these directly from Mr. Winters. Anything you buy through our Eventbrite, we will be able to have signed by the author. So be sure to sign up for that. Don't forget, if you have joined us and you aren't a member of the National Museum of the Great Lakes, please consider joining. You can find out more information about that at nmgl.org/membership. Thank you again, Michelle, for your expertise tonight, and to all of you that have been with us. Stay healthy and safe, and we will see you all again in 4 weeks. Thanks again.